What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and we're talking about some nerfs to the Aeldari Scourge today. Currently, the community is waiting with bated breath for the April data slate to arrive to hopefully repair the dire straits that the balance of Warhammer 40k is sitting in right now. But Games Workshop has got a little bit of a jump on us because they've released to very little fanfare a 9th edition Codex Aeldari FAQ, which has some pretty transformative changes to the faction. This is the first FAQ pass on the Aeldari Codex, which means it's mostly there for wording cleanup and bug fixing, but there are some actual balance changes to take place in this. So it seems like they're using it as a way to start to realign the balance of the faction, at least some of the most powerful pieces in the Craft World side of the Codex. The Harlequin side remains relatively untouched, but I'm sure that's going to be the focus of the data slate, which we have confirmation of is later this week. Right now, it's looking like tomorrow, Thursday, might be the data slate release date, unless it comes out over the weekend, but we'll just have to see. Anyway, let's get into some change notes for this Aeldari Codex FAQ and talk about exactly what has changed. Now, first off, we have a change to Ynnari armies. Previously, if you took a mixed Ynnari army, you would lose your Strands of Fate ability, which was pretty problematic because you were losing the most powerful ability governing Craft World units. So they've clarified that for the purposes of Strands of Fate, Harlequins and Drukhari units in Ynnari detachments are considered to have the Asuryani keyword. Now, note that this only means that you get access to your start of battle round Strands of Fate roll. It doesn't mean that you can use those Strands of Fate dice on those units. You still need the Strands of Fate ability on a unit in order to be able to affect them with those Strands of Fate dice. That said, it means that all of your Asuryani stuff in your Ynnari armies are going to get Strands of Fate, and that is a big bump to the power of Ynnari armies specifically. I know there's a lot of sort of cult following for Ynnari, but they tend to be, because their rules are so bizarre, they tend to be a little bit less effective than just the classic, like, Ulthwé Asuryani armies, and that's unfortunate. So it's nice to see that Ynnari get thrown a little bit of a bone here. Malicious Frenzy is the Twilight Harlequin stratagem that gives a G-Rot might effect, so hit rolls of 6 automatically wound the target, and didn't specify an end to the effect on the stratagem. It's used when the Twilight unit is selected to fight, then impacts their attacks, but doesn't say for the remainder of the phase or something. Now it specifies that the effect is only in place until the attacks are resolved, that the stratagem is affecting. The Psychic Disciplines change is a pretty quick one for Anhrathi units. Anhrathi were able to take the Aeldari Craft World Psychic Disciplines and would replace the Craft World keyword with the Anhrathi keyword, but what they didn't specify are the powers that target core keywords specifically, and they've noted them here in this change. Psychic Fortitudes is a Crusade ability able to be used on Warlocks, and the second sentence of the ability gave it an additional effect if you targeted a Warlock unit of 7 or more. Unfortunately, you can only take Warlocks and units up to 6, so we're just gonna pretend that that never happened. Just giving units abilities that they can't possibly benefit from. Now, we start to get into some pretty hefty changes when we move into the change to Strands of Fate. You probably remember when the Codex was released that there was a big kerfuffle over Strands of Fate, because if you took a non-Craft World Asuryani unit in your army, for example, a Phoenix Lord or a Webway Gate, it would break your Strands of Fate start of battle round roll. This is because the Aeldari Codex requires every unit from your army to have the Asuryani keyword and, importantly, be drawn from the same Craft World. Since units without a Craft World keyword can't be drawn from a Craft World, that means you are no longer eligible for that effect. Now, importantly, we've added this section here, excluding units with the Phoenix Lord keyword, which means that now you can put Phoenix Lords into your Asuryani armies without a problem. Now, here's the part where things get weird. The Strands of Fate ability actually had a different wording in the reference section of the Collector's Edition of the Codex. It only required every unit from your army to have the Asuryani keyword. In fact, it didn't require you to be drawn from the same Craft World. This meant that there was precedent for Phoenix Lords and Webway Gates not to break your Strands of Fate ability. Where things get sticky, though, is that what they've done is update the wording to be similar to that Collector's Edition wording, where Phoenix Lords will still get the ability, but they forgot to include the Webway Gate. So now, the most recently updated version of the ability specifically allows Phoenix Lords to come in and not break your Strands of Fate. But because they didn't include Webway Gates, if you take a Webway Gate in your Craft World Eldar army, you will not get Strands of Fate. That's pretty unfortunate. Templating is so hard for Games Workshop. I don't know why they're having so much trouble with these rules. They got it right once. Why are they changing it? Luck of the Laughing God has been clarified a little bit. Now it has this clause to exclude units with these solitaire or unaligned keywords when you're determining if your army benefits from Luck of the Laughing God. The question here was whether or not solitaires would allow you to get those Luck of the Laughing God dice because they were not performing a Sadith. They don't have the Sadith keyword, so they aren't eligible to perform a Sadith. We had to make a specific ruling for this on the Tactical Tortoise server for our server events because the Sadith keyword is kind of a nightmare of differently worded rules text. The rules designers essentially elected to use a bunch of different phrases to refer to the Sadith keyword, none of which were consistent with each other at all. So whether or not a unit was performing a Sadith was way up in the air. But essentially the Sadith keyword had some unique wording to other sub-faction keywords that other codexes used, where you would select a Sadith that would apply to your entire army, and then, in addition, you would replace the bracketed Sadith keyword with whatever Sadith you picked, meaning that a unit was performing a Sadith whether or not they had the Sadith keyword. It was a nightmare. So ultimately, I don't think that this clarification was required for solitaires to allow your army to benefit from the Luck of the Laughing God, but I do appreciate that it's here because it saves a lot of trouble and questions for the future. The Autarch, Janezar, and Howling Banshees all had their Terror's Lament and Banshee's Mask abilities changed. Now when you select a unit as a target of a charge, you can't be overwatched and they can't set to defend, specifically against that charge. The previous wording inflicted this effect onto the unit for the remainder of that charge phase, meaning that if you charge them with Banshees, they would become unable to overwatch full stop, then you could charge them with something else and they still couldn't overwatch if the Banshees had failed. Now, you can only not overwatch the Banshees, meaning that you do have to get in with your Banshee charge to begin with. That is a nerf to Howling Banshees, but it's not a particularly big change. But the big change here for Behareth is a very transformative one for the faction, because Behareth is one of the most obnoxious characters to deal with that we've seen in a really long time. Not only is he super fast and gives himself objective secured with his ability, but he had the ability to Cloud Strider, that is to Deep Strike teleport, multiple times per turn. Now, we had this little phrase at the front of the Cloud Strider ability, once per turn. So previously, what you could do with Behareth is move him out from behind cover into the middle of the table, shoot anything you wanted to, place your battle focus move with a Cloud Strike, allowing you to teleport anywhere on the table outside of 9 inches of enemy models, use a Strands of Fate dice to automatically pass your charge into those enemy models, fight, consolidate, and use the Cloud Strike again to move back to his initial position. So not only did your opponent not get an opportunity to fight you in that fight phase, you also would just return to your deployment zone where you were at the start of the game, meaning that your opponent didn't really have an opportunity to attack Behareth even after he made his attacks. Now, Behareth is still going to be useful with the ability to wander around and shoot people and teleport and be obnoxious, but teleporting multiple times per phase is no longer something he can do, which I appreciate greatly. Striking Scorpions changed their upgrades very slightly. Now their Shuriken pistol has to be replaced with a Scorpion's Claw, which, to be fair, does have a built-in gun, so you're not really losing that many attacks. Previously, it was worded that your Chain Sword could be replaced with a Scorpion's Claw, which didn't really make sense. Warp Spider's Flicker Jump got the ability for opponents to select new targets for their charge when you flicker jump away. This is the reactive ability that you use when you are targeted by a charge, and you can move the Warp Spider unit 6 inches. This could potentially make your opponent automatically fail their charge if they were outside of 12 inches and couldn't possibly, if they were outside of 13 inches and couldn't possibly roll high enough to get into engagement range of the Warp Spiders. But one thing that Games Workshop has been doing with these abilities, things like Tactica Obliqua in the Adeptus Mechanicus Codex, is allowing those charges to be retargeted to closer units if your opponent has eligible targets for it. This just curbs the power level of these abilities a little bit and makes it slightly less of a negative play experience. Although, obviously, as the Aeldari player, you can play around it by giving them nothing else to charge. Support Weapons Platform got a very small statistical change. Previously, they had an attacks characteristic of 7 and a leadership of 10, which no one believed was actually the case, and sometimes is very annoying, especially if you had small, nimble units that were adept at tying up enemy artillery and preventing them from shooting. A lot of times, especially against these little T3, maybe 5-up save enemies, support weapon platforms threw so many attacks back at them that they would actually just kill those units instead of being tied up, which is very obnoxious. This is clearly a typo, and I'm glad to see it change. Harlequin troops finally have their core keyword. They forgot to print that on the initial version of the datasheet, so now they can be affected by troop masters and stuff. That's exciting. The Solitaire got a little bit of an update to its blitz ability. It usually previously said instead of making a normal move you can blitz, now it says when you make a normal move you can blitz, and then adds additional movement to, and then adds additional inches to their movement as a result of that blitz. Not really a functional change there, just clarifies that blitz is a normal move. There's a designer's note here specifying that abilities that allow you to replace your battle focus move with a set distance still have to reduce the number of inches moved by that battle focus move when moving through area terrain. I don't know anyone who wasn't playing it this way, but it's nice to have that clarification. The other clarification that I do know lots of people who weren't playing this way, because this is absolutely not the way that the rules worked previously, is that when a Strands of Fate dice, that is a dice that is replaced with a 6 using the Strands of Fate ability, is re-rolled, the dice that are replaced by the Strands of Fate ability re-rolled. So they give an example down here, but I'll give an example as well. Let's say you're trying to make a psychic test and you want it to go off on a 10 in order to extend the range of that psychic power, because a lot of the craft world psychic powers have an 18-inch range but bump to 24 if they roll a 10 or more. So you sub in a Strands of Fate die for a psychic test, meaning the dice of your psychic test is a 6, the other one needs to be a 4 or higher in order to get your 10 plus. You roll a 3, so it's a 9. You don't get the power off on a 10, which is unfortunate for you. So you use an ability like Eldrad's ability to reroll, or you spend a CP to reroll in order to try to get that 4 plus. Now previously, the way the rule worked was that the Strands of Fate die was not rolled. Instead, a set number was instituted instead of that dice roll. Because the dice was never rolled, it can't be rerolled. And there was precedent for this, because abilities like Miracle Dice out of the Adeptus Sororitas Codex, which allows you to replace a dice with a dice set to a specific face, were not allowed to be re-rolled if they were subbed in as part of a multi-dice roll that was then re-rolled. The dice that was miracled would stay constant, and the other dice in that roll would be re-rolled. This is the way that it worked for Strands of Fate as well. This is a pretty big change, though, because now dice that are manipulated with the Strands of Fate ability are also re-rolled in addition to any other dice as part of that same roll. So they give an example here. If you're trying to make a 10-inch charge, you sub in a 6, and then the other dice is not high enough to make that 10-inch charge. You want to spend a CP to re-roll that charge roll. You now have to re-roll both the die that was not a 4 or higher and the die that was previously a 6 for Strands of Fate. This is a very big deal because it fundamentally changes how Strands of Fate works in a lot of situations, especially the examples I gave before, psychic tests, as well as charge rolls, any multi-dice roll that you may be fishing for a high number on. Now, re-rolling those is an enormous risk, meaning that Aeldari players are going to be incentivized to take significantly less risks with their Strands of Fate. This means we might see more abilities like Ghost Walk being taken into Aeldari armies to give a bonus to charge in addition to that Strands of Fate charge die, which allows the Aeldari player to confirm long charges without having to rely on a single dice that could potentially be rerolled. So anyway, just a one-page FAQ today, a couple of changes to the Aeldari Codex, but like I said, there are some actual functional balance changes here. Anyway, that's all I have to say for today. I'm very excited for any further changes to this Codex coming out of the data slate. I'm going to be talking about that quite a bit when it comes out, but until then, remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.